Warm and lovely good morning.
Yeah, we went straight from we need heat to we need air conditioning, and I have not been able to break out the scope yet. And with a 10-day forecast, there's one possible day I might be able to shoot. It's really kind of frustrating at this point.
Well, spring has sprung apparently.
I wish it would spring the rest of the way for me. But anyhow, we're going to pick up on part two of the DOJ. We're going to come in the 40s, and I guess it's you.
Yep, the big thing here is we're getting into World War II, and boy, did things change from what they had been in the United States.
Maybe we should preface this whole episode with everything you know is wrong and dogs flew spaceships.
On June 28th, 1940, the Alien Registration Act of 1940 is enacted. It is a major piece of pre-World War II legislation that expands the DOJ's role in immigration enforcement and national security. It is also known as the Smith Act after its chief sponsor, Representative Howard W. Smith, a Democrat from Virginia. The act has two primary components. One, a broad alien registration and fingerprinting requirement, and two, anti-sedition provisions criminalizing advocacy of overthrowing the government by force or violence. This law will directly support the 1940 transfer of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, to the DOJ, giving the department practical tools for tracking and controlling non-citizens or aliens amid fears of espionage, sabotage, and fifth column activities as war is raging in Europe. It is now required of all aliens, age 14 and older, who had been in the United States for 30 days or longer, to register with the federal government and be fingerprinted. The process involves filling out a detailed questionnaire, Form AR2, with 15 questions covering name, birth date and place, entry date and place into the United States, intended activities, length of stay, criminal record, organizational memberships, military service, and attempts at naturalization. Registrants receive an alien registration receipt card as proof, and each is assigned an alien registration number. Address changes must be reported promptly. Over 5.6 million non-citizens are registered and fingerprinted, with some sources citing around 4.7 to 4.9 million by early 1941, with totals reaching higher by 1944. This creates one of the largest civilian data collection efforts in U.S. history at the time. The DOJ and FBI will utilize this information immediately after the events of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941.
You know, in many ways, Jason, the DOJ is a perfect representation of the slow creep towards Big Brother. It starts out as one department. They start shifting into the DOJ. And as we covered in the last episode, they keep throwing components on. Here they are prepping up for war. But in many ways, what you just outlined here is like the seed planting for the Big Brother that's going to come around later. I mean, we're talking about millions of people here. And of course, there's fingerprints on it. What form questionnaire are they asked to fill out? Well, it's AR2. That's a 9/11 in code, almost verbatim. The fun never ends.
I have mixed feelings about that. Yes, you absolutely see a Big Brother kind of thing happening, but at the same time, when you're involved in a war of this scale against people who are absolutely going to do what they can against you, you can't really blame them either.
You know, at this point, there's some truth to that. I mean, I don't think it can be denied, but I have a very difficult time viewing the world wars as someone got out of hand, now we got to react. It's much more than that. And when we look at what you're outlining here, I view it as chess pieces moving on the board. And I guess the question could be asked, did something come up and they're taking advantage, or are they executing a plan? And on a lot of these things, I lean towards executing a plan.
Well, all I can say is Switzerland was left alone, despite the fact that Hitler took everything else around him.
Right. And we can march in there today to find masters of the universe here and there.
After the Pearl Harbor attack, the transfer of power is perceived as critical for the new war efforts. President Roosevelt issues presidential proclamations 2525, 2526, and 2527 that designate German, Italian, and Japanese nationals as enemy aliens. The DOJ, via INS and FBI, leads the Enemy Alien Control Program, which results in the immediate arrest of thousands of suspected, dangerous enemy aliens that utilize pre-compiled lists. Hearings are before alien enemy hearing boards and are often done without full due process, attorneys, or access to evidence. The enemy aliens are brought to internment camps in DOJ INS-run camps, some examples of which are at Fort Missoula in Montana, Fort Lincoln in North Dakota, Santa Fe in New Mexico, and Crystal City in Texas. By the end of the war, over 31,000 enemy aliens and families were interned, comprising of roughly 10,900 plus Germans, 3,200 plus Italians, and 16,800 plus Japanese. The INS constructed and operated the internment facilities, with Border Patrol staffing many of the camps. Some facilities also held deportees from Latin America for potential hostage exchanges. While the transfer enabled targeted enemy alien controls, Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942 authorizes the military-led mass removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans, both citizens and non-citizens, from the West Coast under the War Relocation Authority. The DOJ and INS handled the initial arrests and some of the internment camps, but the larger civilian exclusion is a military operation.
All right, I'm not going to pull punches here. This is the planting of the ideas that we live with today, where human beings do not matter above all other things. Don't you know there's a war on? We can treat these people like that. They're not even American citizens. We'll just throw them in a cage like they're cattle. And what is the executive order we're talking about here? It's a 666 in code. What more do you need to know? The problem is when you say a thing like that to your average person, they're going to look at you cross-eyed like, well, what the heck are you talking about? You're just making things up. But in fact, I'm not. You can go back through so much of this and catch the intent simply by the way things were named or how they were numbered. But here is a big departure from the way human beings were treating each other early 1900s, end of the 1800s. They're going to get treated like cattle, and the slow creep begins. To me, this is absolutely the first footprints on the ground towards the big brother idea. And they're using war as the reason for having done it.
Well, as we were discussing before we started recording, George Carlin had the best comment I've ever heard about this, that the only rights these people had were right this way.
There it is. He had many things to say that hit right down the middle. When we examine the world today and we read what we just read, it's not even shocking to most people, and it should be. It should be absolutely shocking. If you go back and look at what was said to the Japanese people that were yanked out of San Francisco and ported out to the desert, it's shocking. And at the same time, they're going to turn around during the war and they're going to point at other camps, internment and concentration camps, and they're going to scream foul from the top of their lungs while they're doing a version of it in the home of the free and the brave, as it was known back then.
The most famous comment I've ever heard about this was from George Takei of Star Trek fame, who played Mr. Sulu. He was a young boy and spent time in these camps.
Absolutely shameful. And this is what, in my view, we're doing right now. We're going to go through hell-bent chaos because it has to. The bridge too far has to be built so that nobody misses the point that this is unacceptable. And the world we're going into, in my view, is going to drift away from service to self, which is what we're reading, the era of service to self, to service to others. And in an era like that, people don't get treated like cattle. In an era like that, people go, or human beings, maybe I should say, or maybe I should even say life in general, goes to the top, the reason for being, the most important thing. And this is what we're watching and what we're reading now, the manipulation and creep away from the idea that people matter because there's a war on.
May 19th, 1942 sees the creation of the War Division to consolidate war-related activities for greater efficiency and coordination as the U.S. fully mobilizes after the Pearl Harbor attack. The division will handle planning, policy, and administrative oversight, rather than day-to-day investigations or prosecutions, which will remain with the FBI, U.S. attorneys, or other divisions. Its chief predecessor was the Special Defense Unit, which was originally the Neutrality Laws Unit that had been created in April of 1940 in the Office of the Attorney General. This unit is redesignated and folded into the new War Division. Once established, the War Division consists of three parts. The first is the Special War Policies Unit, which directs and coordinates broader DOJ wartime policies. It handles planning, liaison with other agencies, and oversight of policies that affect civil liberties, security, and war-related legal matters. The second is the Alien Enemy Control Unit, which oversees the implementation of the Alien Enemy Control Program, which we just discussed in the previous point. The third is the Alien Property Unit, which manages the seizure, custodianship, and administration of property that is owned by enemy aliens or enemy nationals. This involves vesting or taking legal title of assets, businesses, and patents to prevent them from benefiting the Axis powers. Shortly after creation, the division adds the War Frauds Unit, which originated as the economic section of the Antitrust Division. This unit focuses on investigating and supporting prosecutions of fraud in war production and procurement contracts, such as defective supplies, overcharging, and kickbacks. On August 28, 1943, a major internal reorganization transfers the War Frauds Unit to the Criminal Division for better integration with prosecutorial functions. The Special War Policies Unit continues within the War Division. The division operates with a relatively small headquarters staff in Washington, D.C., while coordinating with field offices, the FBI, INS, and military agencies. All of this is abolished on December 28, 1945, which is shortly after the end of World War II.
All right, there it is. But was it? Was it abolished? Or what had just happened put a path in the road, cut a trail that was not there previously? What you see going on here is the idea that, don't you know there's a war on, and now your civil rights are not what they were because now there's a war on. So we're going to do things like get broader wartime policies, I guess they're calling them at this point, and we're going to affect civil liberties here and other things. War, there's certain things that get done by governments that open up the door for massive changes, and war is one of the biggest. And you've got to realize we're talking about World War II here. It's the last time we declared war. I mean, how long ago was it that you brought that? I think we were doing Vietnam or something, Jason, the first time you brought that up.
I've brought that up a whole bunch of times because in my mind, that's extremely important. Only Congress can declare war. But how many conflicts, or whatever you want to call them, have taken place since the end of World War II?
Winner, winner, chicken dinner. There it is. Only Congress can declare war. Well, guess what? We're going to quit declaring war because that's a hassle. What did our president just do recently? Did he go to Congress and say, I want to go blow the hell out of something? No, he didn't declare war. They just do it. This is what I'm talking about. A new path was beaten where a path didn't exist before, and they can return to that path, or they can camouflage that path. Maybe it never went away and they just told us it went away. Maybe it did go away, but they know where it is now. They're changing all kinds of things to include the way we view what should be allowable during war. One thing is for sure that rights go away during war. During World War I, the world changed in a way that I don't even think we can easily describe to the world at large now. World War II, of all the things that happened, the technology and the reach of the military machine was increased by Lord knows. Very few places left in the war that they can't get people and equipment. The equipment that has to go there has been improved during the process. It's a cold place. Well, we figured out how to deal with that. Our machines can deal with the cold now. Well, it's an island that we can't reach because we can't put enough gas in a plane. Well, we worked that out now. We can get to that island. So World War II is a massive deal on so many fronts, but under it all is the slow creep towards Big Brother, where we exist now.
Well, as I said in part one, World War I took out the world, especially in the Western world as it used to be. And World War II set pretty much in stone the world that we have now, because I'm very much of the mind that World War II set in place the military industrial complex to grow into the monstrosity that it is today.
Think about the relationships too, right, Jason? When there's a war like that, you basically knocking on someone's door and saying, are you with me or against me? And if you're against me, there's going to be a problem. Or for that matter, examine Japan. I mean, we're literally putting out cartoons that dehumanize them, calling them Japs. And what is it? I think it's less than 20 years after World War II. We're best friends and they're making everything.
With the war having been won, there is rapid demobilization of the entire U.S. government apparatus. Temporary wartime structures are dismantled quickly, mirroring the massive military drawdown, with the U.S. Army shrinking from about 8 million in 1945 to under 700,000 by mid-1947. However, there is the very serious matter of international war crimes prosecutions to be dealt with. While the DOJ as an institution is not the lead agency for the major international trials, it will provide significant legal support and personnel. For the International Military Tribunal, the IMT, at Nuremberg, which lasts from November 1945 until October 1946, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson serves as chief U.S. prosecutor. Several DOJ lawyers and staff assist in preparing the case against major Nazi leaders. From 1946 to 1949, there are subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, with the U.S. conducting 12 additional military tribunals in Nuremberg that targets lower-level Nazis, including the Justice Case, or prosecuting German jurists and lawyers for perverting the legal system, doctors' trial, industrialists' trials, and others. The Office of Chief of Counsel for War Crimes, operating under the U.S. military government in Germany, handles these cases. DOJ personnel contribute expertise, though the tribunals are technically military rather than civilian DOJ operations. Tokyo and other Pacific war crimes trials also draw on U.S. legal resources, with some DOJ involvement in supporting roles. Domestically, the DOJ continues denaturalization and deportation proceedings against individuals who are linked to Axis activities or war crimes.
You know what's interesting about this, Jason? I thought of it as you were reading this. There are plenty of occasions where American captives were treated just horribly by Japanese holding them captive. And I do not recall, I could be wrong here, but I do not recall the same level of media speculation and focus on anything like that in Japan. On the other hand, we all know what went on with Germany. I mean, in many ways, is this how America becomes world police, what we're looking at here? But to this day, it is still very difficult to talk about World War II, Nazis, and everything the Nazis were accused of. Where I'm sitting, I'll ask a question that most people are not ready to hear. And that question is, how many of those Germans sitting in those tribunals were characters? And people are going to give me funny looks for that, but I'm serious. How many of them were characters? That is the level of chicanery that I look for when we cover things like this.
But I think a lot bigger question is, how many Nazis never went to trial?
Yeah, that's another good point. Or became Americans.
Well, yeah, and they were brought over, and all through the United States government had major positions of power.
Yeah, not just come to America, but be the first guy running things like NASA. Well, wait a minute. We know how phony baloney NASA is, and a Nazi came over to. So how many characters were there? I think it's a very valid question. And I would further speculate that we are entering a time when things like that are going to become known before too much more time goes by.
Starting in 1946, the DOJ begins its pivot away from wartime activities to the now emerging Cold War priorities. This includes dealing with internal security threats that are posed by Soviet communism and domestic subversion. This transition occurs amid rising U.S.-Soviet tensions concerning events like the Iron Curtain and the Truman Doctrine in 1947, which is a speech made by President Truman to a joint session of Congress, marking a fundamental shift in American foreign policy to take an active leadership role in containing the spread of communism. There's also the Berlin blockade in 1948 and 1949, espionage revelations, and domestic political pressure to demonstrate toughness on communism. In 1945 and 1946, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover directs agents to intensify surveillance of the Communist Party USA. In July of 1945, Hoover had ordered the compilation of a massive 1,850-page report on CPUSA activities, which was delivered in 1946. This report laid the groundwork for viewing the party as a conspiratorial organization that is tied to Soviet interests. The FBI expands its domestic intelligence operations, building on wartime structures, but now focused almost exclusively on communist and leftist groups. Hoover's public warnings about red fascism frames communism as an existential threat to the American way of life.
And the hits just keep coming. Hey, guys, the war's ended. We really need to be able to do all the things we want to do. Let's make up a new, can you imagine be at the branding table? What can we call it? People are pretty burned out on war and battles. I got it. The Cold War. We'll call it the Cold War. This whole thing about communism was another thing put forward that got people to treat one another horribly at whatever level their supposed existential threat was. But again, it's hard to swallow. Where, if we're so anti-communism as was portrayed back then, what are we doing here now? It's almost like we're being pushed in some kind of weird form of technical communism or something. It's all very bizarre, and it all appears, as I look backwards now, as one ploy after another to advance an agenda. What agenda? Well, look around, folks. Do you recognize the world outside your window today? Look around.
Well, as we've discussed multiple times in previous episodes, Dr. John Coleman stated outright in his books that socialism and communism was going to be introduced into this country through the left side of politics to take it down from the inside. And when you look at it from that context and where we were from the 1950s onwards, I don't think that the way certain people like Senator Joe McCarthy, for instance, saw things was wrong. We just didn't know things then as we know them now. And we're at a point now where things are kind of out of control.
I mean, whichever way you frame, you're right. Look at what Coleman did. But when you look at things like McCarthy, what I tend to focus on is the things that were touted, like Hollywood treating one another terribly. Who dropped names? If you dropped a name, you basically did someone in. It's the normalization of getting people to do things and treat each other in a way that was previously unacceptable, whatever the case may be. Even if there's a legitimate reason somewhere in there that you can find, society is being changed by the constant coverage of these things. And consider this, back in the 1800s, what would have been the average view of war by people in that era compared to now up in the coming in on the 50s, what would have been the view by an average person of war then? And now compare it to how we view war now. How I view war now is it never ends. And what we're seeing here is we came off the supposed entire world at war, and all of a sudden now we're in a Cold War, and that's going to go for decades. I mean, that was all you heard. I don't know, Jason. For me, I think I remember constantly hearing the Cold War up at least through the 80s into the early 90s.
Right. That is absolutely spot on. And as far as the wars that never end, that is because we now have a military-industrial complex that is a beast that must always be fed.
Right. And when we cover things like this, like the planting of seeds, we're coming from an era where there's rules here. Congress does this. Well, Congress declares war. We don't declare war anymore. And how come we can do that? Because everyone let us. Because we did the slow creep. We did Lord knows how many events to tie up their minds while we did this. And after we've done it for this period of time, it becomes normalized. The old Overton window is constantly moving to the right. And we can really identify the effect of that from where we're perched now.
On March 21st, 1947, President Truman issues Executive Order 9835, establishing the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. This is a sweeping initiative to screen all current and prospective federal employees for loyalty. The program requires loyalty boards in every federal agency. The Attorney General's office compiles and maintains the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, which are lists of groups that are deemed, quote, totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive. Investigations rely heavily on FBI background checks. Membership in or sympathetic association with listed organizations could trigger a review, even without evidence of illegal acts. Grounds for disqualification include past involvement in protests, labor strikes, or associations that raise questions about loyalty. Truman initially resisted a broad program out of civil liberties concerns, but relented amid Republican gains in the 1946 midterms and fears of communist infiltration. The program will affect millions of federal workers and set a precedent for loyalty oaths and security clearances that will expand in the 1950s.
If I want to look at this with a clear view, I would ask a simple question like, if people might not want to be loyal to you, is the problem with them or is the problem with you? If you're doing this across Lord knows how many people, but here we are back to that old mob idea, Jason. Don't give it a name, Vinny. Well, here we go. We're going to give it a name. We're going to have totalitarianisms, fascists, communism. We're going to give it a name and beat that name into the head of every person looking, and look what we're going to get away with when we put these scary ideas with names forward. And the further we get into the era we're heading, as we look back, it's almost hard to imagine some of the things that have happened and everybody knew they were happening, but it seemed okay at the time.
Well, to be fair, you can't really blame them after the massive conflict that they just fought.
Exactly. And I've said this so many times. People come up and say, Crow, you claimed your grandparents were called the greatest generation. Well, why did they allow all this to happen? And I explain it every time. They were the greatest generation, comparatively speaking, what that's supposed to mean, how they treated each other, how they lived, the things they did, how they worked, how they created things. But here's the deal. They went into World War II and they lost loved ones, and they came back without arms and legs or brothers or whatever the case may be. And they were told that if we don't win this, we're all going to be goose stepping under Nazis. And when they did win, they were told, you are the white knight of the entire universe. You saved the world. That's what they were told. They were proud of this country going into it. When they came out of it, they were more than proud. They were so happy to have done what they did. And what they were told made it even more so. And here's the rub. They had no suspicion that they shouldn't be trusting the people in charge. It's quite the opposite based on what had just occurred.
In July of 1948, the DOJ indicts 12 top leaders of the CPUSA National Board, including Eugene Dennis, the party's general secretary. The indictment charges a conspiracy that dates back to at least 1945. The landmark trial, United States versus Dennis, begins in New York in 1949. Prosecutors argue that the CPUSA's Marxist-Leninist ideology and organizational structure constitutes a clear and present danger, especially given Soviet actions abroad. All 11 defendants who stood trial are convicted on October 14, 1949. One of the accused, William Z. Foster, is severed and is handled in a separate case due to serious heart illness, and would later be found not guilty as the others, and would actually continue to be the public face and national chairman of the CPUSA during the height of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, although his health concerns continued to be a serious issue until his death in 1961 at the age of 80 after traveling to the Soviet Union for medical treatment. The convictions of his fellow travelers, however, are upheld by the Supreme Court in Dennis versus the United States in 1951, which applies a modified, clear and present danger test. These prosecutions aimed to decapitate the CPUSA leadership and render the party ineffective. These will be followed by additional Smith Act cases in the 1950s in California, Seattle, and elsewhere, though later Supreme Court rulings, notably Yates versus United States in 1957, will narrow the law to require advocacy of concrete illegal action rather than abstract doctrine.
Abstract doctrine. No, there's got to be some facts around here somewhere. There's got to be an actual point. The irony where we sit now should be lost on nobody. Problem is, a lot of people aren't old enough to recall the whole Cold War, communism is bad thing. But basically, at the base of it, communism is one of the worst things in the world, and you should be so happy that you're a free American. You have freedom. You know what those poor communists over there would do just to listen to a Beatles album? Okay, that's what we were told, or some semblance of that idea. The very same American government that pushed that agenda has consistently stripped rights from its own citizenry nonstop ever since, just to make the point.
By 1949, the DOJ is fully reoriented, with the Civil Rights Section continuing its slow work on domestic rights, while national security becomes a dominant focus amid the Soviet atomic test in 1949 and the rise of McCarthyism as we move into the 1950s. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court decides Brown versus Board of Education, declaring that segregated public schools are unconstitutional. The DOJ, now under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, had filed an amicus brief supporting desegregation, marking increased federal involvement in civil rights. On September 9, 1957, President Eisenhower signs the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which is the first major civil rights law since the Reconstruction era, which focuses on voting rights protections. On December 9, 1957, Attorney General William P. Rogers establishes the Civil Rights Division, elevating the earlier Civil Rights Section. This gives the DOJ dedicated prosecutorial tools for civil rights violations, though early enforcement remains cautious.
Well, there's a sad truth to be recognized here. I don't know at what point of my adulthood I began to recognize what it means to be a citizen and what civil rights actually are, but I can define that pretty easily right now. You're born with God-given rights. When you become a citizen, you give away your God-given rights and you get lesser rights so that you can do things and use things and go places. That's a fact, regardless of how anyone feels. You can take that deal all day long because we have free will, but that's the way I view it. If we back up a little bit, we can see that now they're starting to take the communist idea. They're going to mix in the race card, which never fails to get a rise out of the masses. But under all this, we've been talking about another new thing that's been brought into the world, that's nukes. Well, I've stated for many years now, nukes do not exist as described. If I am correct in what I just said, what does that tell you about nearly everything we are talking about, from the DOJ to the World War and everything around it? Because if I am right, that means everyone was in on it. If America claimed they had nukes they didn't have, don't you think that Russia might say you don't have nukes? Just saying.
Moving into the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy appoints his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as the Attorney General. He is initially seen as being more focused on organized crime, but becomes deeply involved in civil rights enforcement. In 1961 and 1962, the DOJ is involved in the Freedom Rides, which protect interstate travelers against violence, as well as the integration of the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, in 1962, where federal marshals and troops are deployed amid riots. In 1963, the DOJ supports the March on Washington and pushes for comprehensive civil rights legislation. RFK plays a key role in convincing President Kennedy to propose what will become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The department also files numerous voting rights and school desegregation suits, often facing resistance from Southern states.
It is very difficult to look at what's actually going on when the horrible things that are going on around the idea of civil rights are being blasted at you through the news and through the papers. These are characters, these two brothers on the world stage. They're the first Catholics that are ever going to come along. That's all I'm going to say about it. If you want to take the time to try to verify or not verify what I just said, I would urge you to do so. But what's going on here is there is a manipulation at levels that defy being described. It is almost like maybe there were parts of World War II when the military might was actually testing the entire world to see, could we just put on our steel-toed boots and take everything and control it? And I think they found out they can't, because when you do that, people get upset. So then the whole thing shifted to, we're going to get them to accept what we're doing. Not only are we going to get them to accept what we're doing, we're going to get them to go along and ask for what we're doing. And you may ask the question, what are they doing? Look around the world right now. There's a world takeover coming. There are things called 15-minute cities where every supposed civil right you ever had is off the table. You live here, you don't leave here. If you use too much energy, that's a problem. Everything's a problem. By the way, we got cameras everywhere and they ID you instantly. How can we ever forget that and not compare it back to all the things that have led here?
On July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This sweeping law bans discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and schools, and authorizes the Attorney General to file suits to enforce desegregation. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division becomes the primary enforcer. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This outlaws discriminatory voting practices such as literacy tests and introduces the pre-clearance formula, which requires DOJ approval for changes to voting laws in jurisdictions with histories of discrimination. This gives the Civil Rights Division powerful new tools to protect Black voting rights. On April 11, 1968, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination in housing sales and rentals. This comes days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination and amid urban unrest. DOJ enforcement intensifies at this time as the Civil Rights Division pursues school desegregation cases nationwide, voting rights litigation, and police brutality investigations. Federal marshals and FBI support are frequently deployed during the various protests and riots.
The race card never fails to pay dividends when they want to move pieces and expand their authority. Do you recall that corporations made many runs in this country and were turned down many times, being told, no, you cannot form a corporation. How does that benefit men and women? Finally, one of the stories we're told about the onset of corporations is they said, we want to form a corporation to protect minorities. I believe it was Black people. And they finally got their way. But within the first year of those corporations, it is documented that there were more of them that looked like corporations we recognize than were protecting anyone's rights. And do I need to point out to anyone that it is not governments that run this world right now? It is two things. It is corporations that control everything from the wealth to the products wealth can buy and the military machine. There was a time when they said, no, those corporations are not benefiting us. They played the race card. They got their corporation. Now who's doing what we see going on? Corporations are a major cause of what we see.
Oh, I think you left out a major power player there, and that's the Vatican.
Well, there's always the Vatican, but they hide so well, Jason.
The late 1960s and into the 1970s sees a significant broadening of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division mandate. While the division's early focus, post-1957, had centered on racial desegregation and voting rights for African Americans in the South, the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent laws enabled it to address discrimination on additional grounds that included sex, national origin, and issues affecting Native American and Hispanic Latino communities. This evolution comes amid the era's expanding social movements, such as with women's rights, the Chicano movement, and Red Power, Indian self-determination. The DOJ has a growing role as the federal government's primary enforcer of equality laws. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 explicitly prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created as the primary administrative enforcer for private sector Title VII claims. But the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, specifically its Employment Litigation Section, had the authority to bring pattern or practice lawsuits against employers, which included state and local governments who were showing systemic discrimination.
This is all a bit laughable if we use logic. For one thing, one of the major side effects of all this is they're expanding their authority to control people. But let me ask you, is race relations and gender relations as bad as it has ever been in my lifetime? Maybe part of that, not quite from the 60s, but as a general rule, this accomplished nothing. This supposed we're going to enforce race, color, all these other things. If you go outside right now, the problems that existed then pretty much exist now, maybe in slightly different forms, and gender has rose much higher than it used to be.
I would suggest that things chilled out, especially in the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s. And it wasn't until one particular president took charge that that pot got stirred massively again, to the point where things were actually becoming a problem. And today it is a problem again because of the things that were put into place. But for the longest time, I don't think most people cared, with a few exceptions, of course.
I imagine it's almost like a science for the powers that be now. When they want to expand their power or get something or move chess pieces, they know without a doubt how to implement the race card, how to present it, and what they're going to get while that's going on. And that's just one of the many cards they can play. As we have recently seen, gender can rise almost to the same level, maybe to the same level.
In the late 1960s, the DOJ had grown rapidly due to the explosion of civil rights enforcement, rising crime rates, urban unrest, Vietnam War-related cases, and new regulatory responsibilities, leading the department to need stronger day-to-day operational management. The existing Deputy Attorney General role, originally created on May 24, 1950, is elevated in prominence and workload, and supporting structures are expanded or formalized to help the Attorney General manage the increasingly complex bureaucracy. The Deputy Attorney General now functions as the second-ranking official and de facto Chief Operating Officer of the DOJ. Responsibilities include overseeing the day-to-day operations of most components, supervising the 93-plus U.S. attorneys, and later the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys, handling a wide range of legal, policy, and administrative decisions that do not require the personal attention of the Attorney General, and acting as the Attorney General in the AG's absence or disability. By the mid to late 1960s, the sheer volume of work, especially the surge in Civil Rights Division litigation, FBI expansion, and new federal programs, had made a deputy-level office essential for coordination. The Office of the Deputy Attorney General, as a formalized supporting structure, gains greater visibility and staffing during this period to manage the department's growth.
Boy, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, Jason. Correct me if I'm wrong. It looks like they're coming full circle. When I was doing the work on the seal that's all lied about and has its tentacles going to places you've never heard of, wasn't it the Attorney General that the seal came from to the DOJ, or did I misremember that?
No, that sounds right.
Yeah, so they've come full circle here. The attorney general gives up all this power so the DOJ can be formed, or they shift all this power. Maybe that's a better way to say it. And now they're going back to add a deputy attorney general. This is full circle. They must be pleased. Their plans succeed admirably.
Well, as we've seen pretty much forever, the government never shrinks. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
We're from the government and we're here to help you. The check's in the mail.
By the 1970s, the Civil Rights Division is reorganizing and adds sections to handle the considerably wider caseload. The DOJ balances aggressive enforcement with political realities, such as the slower pace under President Richard M. Nixon's administration compared to the Kennedy and Johnson years. This period establishes the Civil Rights Division as a versatile enforcer of multiple protected classes, which moves it toward the comprehensive role that it plays today, which includes disability rights, which will emerge later.
It's interesting at the end of the 60s is really a change point where America's not really going to resemble very quickly what it once did to the early 60s and into the 50s and back through the 40s. And one of the things that always stands out is when I was young, there was this idea that the first televised presidential skirmish was between Kennedy and Nixon, and that Nixon lost it. But the reason is what makes this such a different world. It wasn't because his policy or his idea or his politics mattered at all. It was because he was on camera, Kennedy was handsome, and he sweated. And that shows the major shift and power and control that is being exerted when you can get away with that kind of nonsense when you're talking about the supposed highest office in the country. And of course, later on in the 80s, they'll follow that up with actually taking an actor that everybody knows out of Hollywood and giving him this top spot. Nobody seeming to wake up enough to ask, well, wait a minute, is he acting or is he being a president right now?
After being the governor of California, mind you.
Well, that's the way it happens. I mean, Arnold's doing it, right? Will they change the rules so he can have a run?
On June 17th, 1972, the Watergate scandal begins when 5 men linked to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign are arrested while breaking into and planting listening devices at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Initial investigations by the FBI, U.S. attorneys, and the DOJ reveal connections to the White House and Nixon's inner circle, which includes aides like H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Mitchell, who had served as Attorney General from 1969 to 1972. As evidence mounts of a cover-up, which includes hush money payments, destruction of evidence, and perjury, the DOJ is facing accusations that senior officials had obstructed justice to protect the president. In May of 1973, amid growing pressure, Attorney General Elliot Richardson, who was appointed by Nixon, appoints Harvard law professor Archibald Cox as a special prosecutor with a promise of independence to investigate the break-in and any related White House misconduct. Cox's team quickly seeks access to Nixon's secret Oval Office tape recordings, which are believed to contain direct evidence of the cover-up.
This is a major change point. This is going to go on, this Watergate thing, till like 1980. It's just going to keep coming back in one form or another, and it's going to dominate news cycles and almost everything else. But at this point, there is a major shift in how people in this country think about their government. This is one of the first moves of the Overton window to make the top seat in this country, we are told, dishonorable, and that's the way it's going to stay. This is where you no longer look at the president with respect like the character Kennedy and, compare him to the King Arthur. He's Camelot of America, that honor, that, lofty office. It's the exact opposite. The Simpsons moved into the Oval Office and they're never moving out. But that does bring us to the break point for hour one. You want to add anything in, Jason?
Well, I would say that Watergate was part of a 1-2 punch to really change Americans' perception of their country. The first one being the very long and drawn out Vietnam conflict, followed up with a complete change of viewpoint on the office of the president, which was, for the most part, very respected before this.
It was. And there's going to be things that follow: presidents without elections, top people who are 1 or 2 seats away from taking the presidency in emergency that don't even know what the progression is. It's literally the Simpsons have moved into the White House. But that does bring us to the top of hour 1 for episode 676. Hour 1 is free to everybody at pro777radio.com. Members know to log in for the full episode. Members get access to all the forums and comments sections. They get access to the 2-hour film called Shoot the Moon. Very good film, good for the entire family. No bad language, as is usual here. And also, members get exclusive access to my solar work, which should be picking up any day here now that we're in spring, because I no longer post my work to censorship platforms that claim control of the work. With that, we hope to see you logged in as a member for hour 2, and I'd like to wish you all a happy, healthy, and higher-minded new era. There it is, man. Cheers.